That's right, Sergeant. And now you will beg for forgiveness, on your knees in the middle of this roadblock, and then we'll talk about your future in the force." Her voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a sentence. Almeida, his legs trembling and his dignity shattered, fell to his knees on the hot asphalt, head bowed, while the awkward silence of the checkpoint became the loudest of condemnations. The hot asphalt burned Almeida's knees, but the physical pain was a mere nuisance compared to the blaze of humiliation consuming his soul. Every fiber of his being screamed in protest, but the icy voice of that woman, the new presiding judge, had silenced any last shred of pride. He was there, on his knees, in the middle of a roadblock, before his subordinates, curious drivers, and worse still, the indiscreet lenses of cell phones that he knew were already recording every second of his downfall. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the intermittent click of cameras. His eyes cast down, fixed on the cracks in the concrete, trying to find a hole to hide in. The image of the golden badge, which she had pulled out with calculated coldness, was seared into his retina. It wasn't just a badge, it was a lightning bolt, a thunderclap that had struck him squarely, disintegrating his authority, his reputation, his career. "Trash delivery woman," he had said. The words now came back to haunt him, each syllable a whip on his back, the slap on her helmet, the kick to her motorcycle. Thoughtless acts, driven by an inflated ego and blind arrogance now transformed into shackles. The other officers, his men, were petrified. Their gazes, once respectful or fearful, were now a mix of shock, embarrassment, and palpable fear. They had witnessed the disintegration of their sergeant, the personification of authority right there on the street, reduced to nothing by a woman who, minutes earlier, had been just another poor motorcyclist. Hierarchy, order, everything had been turned upside down. No one dared to move, no one dared to speak. The air was heavy, dense, charged with a tension that seemed about to explode. The judge, for her part, remained standing, a statue of relentless justice. Her eyes swept the scene, without apparent emotion, but Almeida could feel the weight of her judgment. There was no haste in her movements, not a hint of explicit satisfaction on her face, just the coldness of someone executing a sentence. She didn't need to shout. Her presence, her absolute control of the situation, spoke louder than any megaphone. It was the calm before the storm, and Almeida knew the storm was yet to come. After what seemed like an eternity, but was only a few agonizing minutes, her voice broke the silence again. A whisper that to Almeida sounded like a roar. "Get up, Sergeant Almeida." He obeyed, his legs wobbly, his body trembling, his dignity shattered. He rose, avoiding her gaze, avoiding everyone's gaze. The judge made a subtle gesture with her head to one of the younger officers. "Sir, please end the roadblock. And you, Sergeant Almeida, come with me. We have much to discuss." The order was carried out with almost robotic efficiency. The cones were collected, the cars released. The scene, once a stage of public humiliation, began to dissolve, but the images and whispers would remain. Almeida followed the judge, each step a battle against his own body and boiling mind. The walk to her car, a discreet, dark sedan, was a gauntlet of curious glances and muffled whispers. He could smell the gossip, the bitter taste of defeat. Upon reaching the vehicle, she opened the passenger door with a fluid movement. "Get in, Sergeant." Her voice left no room for objections. Almeida obeyed, feeling the cold upholstery of the leather seat. She walked around the car and sat behind the wheel, starting the engine. Silence returned, but now it was an intimate, heavy, claustrophobic silence. The car began to move, leaving behind the dismantled roadblock and the wreckage of Almeida's reputation. The destination was uncertain, but the promised conversation hung in the air like a guillotine. Almeida tried to organize his thoughts, to find a strategy, a defense, But his mind was chaos. Rage boiled, mixed with fear and shame. How had he, an experienced sergeant, fallen so low? Why was she doing this? Revenge? Power? The judge drove with disturbing calm, her eyes fixed on the road. Finally, she broke the silence without looking away. "Sergeant Almeida, you seem surprised, but I must confess I'm not. Unfortunately, your behavior is not an isolated case. It is a symptom, and my mission is to eradicate this disease." She paused, and Almeida felt a chill run down his spine. Her voice was low, but each word was a hammer striking his head. "You assaulted a citizen, damaged private property, and used your position to humiliate. And all of this, Sergeant, because of a ridiculous prejudice. Trash delivery woman, you said. Little did you know you were insulting the person in charge of ensuring justice is served in this judicial district, including in cases like yours." The last sentence was spoken with a cold sting of irony that chilled Almeida's blood. The conversation had barely begun, and he already felt his world crumbling. His future in the force. It seemed increasingly distant, more improbable, another shattered dream. The silence in the judge's car was an almost unbearable weight, more oppressive than the heat of the asphalt or the scornful glances at the roadblock. Almeida felt cold sweat trickle down his back, a shiver that didn't come from the gentle air conditioning, but from the dread settling in his chest. Her words, "eradicate this disease," echoed in his mind like a sentence. He wasn't just a sergeant who made a mistake. He was a symptom, a manifestation of something larger that she was determined to extirpate. He tried to formulate a response, an excuse, anything that might soften the blow. "Judge, I didn't know. It was a moment of stress. The pressure of the streets." The words came out dragged, without conviction, and he hated them the instant he uttered them. They sounded hollow, pathetic. The judge, without taking her eyes off the road unfolding ahead, merely shook her head slightly. An almost imperceptible movement, but one that carried the force of total rejection. "Stress, Sergeant, pressure, we all deal with it. The difference is how we choose to react. You chose violence, humiliation, the abuse of power, and you did it against a citizen who, by chance, was your hierarchical superior in another context, and who is now your judge." The coldness in her voice was cutting. There was no anger, no emotion, just the relentless logic of someone who had already reached a conclusion. Almeida felt cornered, every escape route closed. He looked at his own hands, clenched on his knees, trying to find some trace of the man he was minutes before, the man who gave orders, who commanded respect, who feared only his direct superiors. Now he was there, a defenseless defendant. "I understand the gravity of the situation, Judge." He tried again, his voice a little firmer but still laden with a veiled plea. "I am willing to accept the consequences, a punishment, a suspension. I just ask that you consider my record, years of service, without a single blemish on my file." The judge finally averted her gaze from the road for a brief instant, fixing him with an intensity that made him recoil. "Your record, Sergeant, what you did today was not a blemish. It was a tear, an open wound in public trust. And the fact that you have a clean record until now only makes me question how many other trash delivery people you have humiliated without a presiding judge nearby to witness." The accusation, implicit and direct, hit him squarely. He had no answer for it. The truth was, yes, he had used his authority in questionable ways before, had disrespected citizens he considered lesser, had acted with arrogance. But never before had he been caught so spectacularly, so devastatingly. The car continued to advance, leaving behind the city's buzz and entering a more residential area, with tree-lined streets and imposing houses. Almeida didn't recognize the way. Where was she taking him? The uncertainty added a new layer of anxiety to his torment. You mentioned accepting the consequences, Sergeant, the judge continued, her voice maintaining the same calm, relentless tone. And I appreciate your resilience. But the consequences in this case will be determined by me, and they will not be a suspension or an internal administrative punishment. What you did today, Sergeant Almeida, is subject to criminal prosecution, assault, property damage, abuse of authority, not to mention public humiliation. And I, as a judge, have a duty to ensure that the law is applied without privileges. The words, criminal prosecution, fell upon him like stones. His blood ran cold. He had thought of a reprimand, perhaps a transfer, but not something that could lead him to jail. The image of himself handcuffed in the defendant's box was unbearable. His world wasn't just crumbling, it was being pulverized. No. Judge, please, he stammered, despair taking over. I can redeem myself. I can do whatever it takes. I swear I'll never again. I've learned my lesson. I can apologize formally. I can pay for the damage to the motorcycle. I can. She interrupted him, not with a shout, but with a heavy silence that was far more effective. The car stopped in front of a modern house with sober and elegant architecture and a well-kept garden. It wasn't a courthouse, nor a police station. It was a residence. Sergeant Almeida, she said, turning off the engine and facing him, her eyes fixed on his, unwavering. The late afternoon light streamed through the window, illuminating her face to highlight the seriousness of her expression. You will redeem yourself, but not in the way you imagine. And the lesson you learned today is just the beginning. I am not interested in empty apologies or promises made under duress. I am interested in change, real, profound. She opened the car door and got out, leaving him there, stunned, his heart pounding erratically. He watched as she walked around the vehicle, opening the driver's door and looking at him again. Come, Sergeant. The conversation I promised won't be in my office nor in your precinct. It will be here, and it won't just be about your future in the force. It will be about your future, and about what you can do so that others don't follow your example, or so that if they do, they encounter someone like me in their path. Almeida felt a chill run down his spine. The house, once a mystery, now seemed like a private purgatory. He knew he was about to enter completely unknown territory where the rules were hers and the scales of justice tipped heavily against him. The humiliation at the roadblock had been merely the prologue. The real judgment was about to begin, and he had no idea what to expect. The cool night air, which should have been a relief, seemed to tighten Almeida's chest even more. He got out of the car, his legs still heavy, as if every muscle fiber was in protest. The judge's house was imposing, but not ostentatious. Clean lines, large windows that reflected the last glow of twilight, a minimalist but impeccable garden. Everything there exuded control, order, an aesthetic that brutally contrasted with the chaos that had settled in his life. There were no bars, no high walls, but Almeida felt more trapped than in any police cell. He followed her, observing the way she moved, with calculated grace, each step firm and deliberate. The front door opened silently, revealing an interior that mirrored the exterior, neutral tones, indirect lighting, abstract artworks on the walls. There was no warmth there, no familiar clutter he knew in his own home. It was an environment of thought, of precision, of judgment. She didn't invite him to sit, nor did she offer him a glass of water. She simply led him to a room that appeared to be an office or a library. Shelves filled with books, a large dark wooden table in the center, modern design chairs. She sat in one of the chairs, gesturing for him to sit in the other, directly opposite her. The table between them seemed an insurmountable barrier, a stage for the interrogation that would follow. Almeida sat down, sinking into the cold upholstery, his hands sweating on his knees. Silence returned, but now it was even denser, filled by the distant ticking of a clock and the sound of his own labored breathing. He tried to decipher her expression, but her eyes were a well of seriousness, impenetrable. "Sergeant Almeida," she began, her voice calm, but with a resonance that filled the room. "You are here because I believe that justice is not just punishment. It is also re-education. It is the opportunity to transform a mistake into a catalyst for something greater." Almeida swallowed hard. I am willing to do anything, Judge. To compensate for the damage, to apologize publicly. I can even leave the force, if that's what it takes." The last sentence came out in a whisper, the prospect of losing everything a blow even harder than the humiliation. She tilted her head slightly, a movement that could be interpreted as curiosity or disapproval. "Leave the force? It's an option, Sergeant. One I would seriously consider given your behavior, but it's not the only one. And frankly, it's not the one that interests me most right now." He watched her, confused. If it wasn't to remove him, what did she want? "What interests me, Sergeant Almeida, is that you understand the depth of your mistake. Not just the act itself, but the mindset that spawned it, the contempt, the prejudice, the arrogance of power, and that you use this understanding to make a difference." She paused, and Almeida felt the weight of her words. "You said you have a clean record, that you've never had a blemish, but the truth is, many trash delivery people don't have the privilege of encountering a presiding judge in the middle of a roadblock. They just swallow the humiliation, the injustice, and move on, believing that the law doesn't protect them." The accusation, though indirect, was a punch to the gut. He knew she was right. How many times had he acted that way, certain of impunity, of his victim's invisibility? "I don't want you to be merely punished, Sergeant," she continued, her voice gaining a subtle intensity. "I want you to be a mirror for the force, for society. I want you to show that change is possible, even for those who consider themselves above it." Almeida felt a chill. What was she proposing? A re-education program, humiliating community service? "Starting tomorrow, Sergeant Almeida," she declared, and the coldness in her voice made him hold his breath. "You will no longer be an active police sergeant. You will be my personal assistant, not in court nor in my chambers. You will work directly with me on a project I am developing to combat abuse of authority and prejudice within law enforcement agencies. You will be my eyes and ears, but above all, you will be an example." Almeida's mind reeled. Personal assistant? Hers? The one he called a trash delivery woman? The one whose motorcycle he kicked? The humiliation was unbearable. He would be stripped of his uniform, his badge, his authority, to serve the woman he had assaulted. I don't understand, Judge," he stammered, his voice choked. How does this redeem me? How is this a punishment?" She looked at him with an expression that left no room for doubt. "The punishment, Sergeant, is the loss of your pride. It is the need to confront your own prejudices every day, to work alongside those you despised. It is the chance to see the world through the eyes of those at the bottom of the pyramid, not at the top. And above all, it is the chance to, perhaps one day, regain a part of the dignity you lost today. You will have a salary, of course," she added, almost as an aside, "equivalent to that of an entry-level administrative employee. And your duties will include everything from researching cases of abuse to organizing events and direct interaction with marginalized communities. You will be under my direct supervision 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, if necessary. And any deviation in conduct, any sign of your old arrogance, will result in the immediate initiation of the criminal prosecution I mentioned. With aggravating circumstances." Her words were a final blow. He had no choice. It was this or jail. It was public humiliation, and the loss of everything, or private humiliation and the chance, however minimal, to survive. He found himself caught in a web he himself had woven, and the spider sitting before him was relentless. "And your motorcycle, Judge?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. I can pay for the repairs." She smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. "My motorcycle? Don't worry about it, Sergeant. It's already being repaired. And curiously, the mechanic is a former delivery rider who lost his job due to an accident caused by a hasty and arrogant police officer. He'll be happy to know that you, a sergeant, will be working for me. Perhaps you can even help him deliver some parts from time to time. After all, you have experience with that, don't you?" Almeida felt his blood run cold. The irony was cruel, the humiliation complete. He wasn't just losing his status, he was being forced to live the life he so despised. The real judgment wouldn't be in a courtroom, but every day, in every task, under the watchful eye of the judge. He was a prisoner in his own skin, condemned to forced re-education. The future, once uncertain, now unfolded with brutal clarity. He would be her trash delivery man. And there was nowhere to run. The night air had never seemed so heavy, so laden with shame. Almeida felt the final blow of the judge's words, each syllable a hammer striking his pride, his identity. Trash delivery man. The irony was a blade twisting in his stomach. He, the respected sergeant, the man of the law, would now be the living embodiment of what he most despised, an assistant, a lackey, a delivery man. He rose from the chair, his legs wobbly, as if he had run a marathon. The silence in the room was deafening, filled only by the ringing in his ears. The judge watched him, impassive, as if before a defendant who had just received a death sentence, and in a way it was the death of his old life. "Understood, Sergeant Almeida?" Her voice cut through the air, cold and precise. "There is no room for negotiation. Your choice is between this and criminal prosecution, and believe me, I will make sure that every detail of your conduct is publicly exposed. The press would love the story of a sergeant who assaulted a presiding judge." He swallowed hard, the rough saliva in his throat. There was no way out, nowhere to run. His life, his future, everything was in her hands, shaped by his own arrogance. "Yes, Judge," he managed to stammer, his voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. I understood." She stood up, circling the table with the same calculated grace as before. She stopped in front of him, just inches away, and Almeida caught the subtle scent of her perfume, an aroma that would now forever be associated with his ruin. "Good. Tomorrow at 8 in the morning I want you here, casual but decent attire. And bring with you a list of all your assets and bank accounts. We'll need a basis for calculating any future compensation should you fail in your re-education." The mention of his assets was another punch. She wasn't just stripping him of his pride, she was threatening his financial security, his family. He was a married man with children. The shame wouldn't be his alone. He nodded, unable to utter another word. The judge opened the office door, indicating the exit. Almeida walked like an automaton, each step a battle against the gravity of his own disgrace. The house, once a purgatory, now seemed like a mausoleum for his old life. As he left, the cool night air hit him, but brought no relief. The city looked different, distant lights flickering like judging eyes. He got into his car, the scent of leather and despair mingled. He drove home in a trance, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The image of her helmet, the kick to her motorcycle, that golden badge, everything replayed in an infernal loop. At home, the living room light was on. His wife, Anna, was waiting for him with a worried expression. "Almeida, where have you been? Did something happen? You're pale." He couldn't answer. The lie, the truth, neither seemed appropriate. How could he explain that the sergeant she knew, the strong and confident man, had been broken, humiliated, transformed into a servant of the woman he assaulted? He simply hugged her, a desperate embrace, seeking solace he knew he didn't deserve. The night was long and sleepless. Almeida tossed and turned in bed, the ticking of the living room clock echoing the countdown to his new hell. He thought of fleeing, of disappearing, but the threat of criminal prosecution, of having his life exposed, was an invisible shackle. He was trapped. At dawn, the sun seemed brighter, crueler. He got up, his body heavy, his mind boiling. He looked at the uniform hanging in the closet, the badge gleaming. That was no longer his. That was a relic of a past he had destroyed. He put on jeans and a polo shirt, clothes he rarely wore for work. He felt naked, unprotected, without the armor of authority. Breakfast was a torment. Anna tried to talk, but he could barely form coherent sentences. At 7:30, he was back in the car, his stomach churning. The drive to the judge's house seemed longer, each kilometer a torture. He stopped in front of the gate, which opened automatically. The house, once imposing, now seemed like an impregnable fortress. The judge was waiting for him at the door with a serious expression. She didn't say good morning. She simply led him back to the office. The dark wooden table seemed even larger, colder. "Sit down, Sergeant," she said, pointing to the same chair from the previous night. "Did you bring what I asked for?" He handed over an envelope with the documents. She leafed through them quickly, showing no emotion. "Very good. Your first day will be dedicated to understanding the true dimension of the problem we are going to combat. You will spend the morning researching cases of abuse of authority against delivery riders and informal workers. I want detailed reports with names, dates, and the consequences for the victims. And in the afternoon..." She paused, and Almeida felt a chill. "In the afternoon, you will go to the mechanic, the one who is repairing my motorcycle. His name is Carlos. He has a story you need to hear. And who knows, perhaps you can even help him deliver some parts from time to time. After all, you have experience with that, don't you?" The judge smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, but that chilled Almeida's blood. "After all, Sergeant, you have experience with that, don't you? With deliveries, and with the life of those on the street. It's time for you to learn to see the world through their eyes, through the eyes of a trash delivery man." Almeida felt the weight of humiliation crush him. He was a prisoner, not of bars, but of his own conscience and the relentless justice of the judge. The first day of his new life, of his forced re-education, had begun, and he knew it would be merely the prologue to a long and painful ordeal. The hum of the computer was the only sound filling the judge's office, a cruel contrast to the oppressive silence Almeida carried within himself. He was sitting in the same leather chair, but now, instead of being the defendant, he was the researcher. The screen before him displayed a series of digital documents, cases of abuse of authority, each a stab at his pride. The judge, seated at her desk, wasn't observing him directly, but her presence was a gravitational force, pulling at every thought, every movement. "Start with cases of physical and verbal assault, Sergeant." Her voice cut through the air, without even lifting her eyes from her own work. "Pay attention to the details, the victims' descriptions, the consequences for their lives. I want a concise summary of each, highlighting the aggressor's behavioral patterns and the vulnerability of the assaulted." Almeida felt a knot in his stomach. With each click, each new page that opened, he was confronted with the mirrored image of his own actions. Names, dates, vivid descriptions of kicks, punches, humiliating words. "Trash delivery man." The phrase echoed in his mind, now with a different weight, an echo of other voices, of other victims. He read about family fathers who lost their jobs because of a damaged motorcycle, about young people whose dreams were crushed by violent and unjust approaches, about the distrust and fear that had taken root in the communities. He tried to maintain distance, the objectivity of an officer analyzing a report, but it was impossible. Each story was a reminder of his own arrogance, his own prejudice. He saw the pain in the accounts, the helplessness, the sense of injustice that he, in his position of power, had never considered. The armor of his authority, which once protected him from any empathy, was now cracked, and the raw reality seeped through the fissures. The judge stood up, walking to the window, her back to him. "It's easy to judge from above, isn't it, Sergeant? To say they're criminals, that they deserve it. But when you sit down and read the stories one by one, the perspective changes, or it should change." She turned, her eyes fixed on him. "Are you recording the victims' emotions? The breach of trust, the feeling that the state, which should protect them, is their greatest oppressor?" Almeida swallowed hard. "Yes, Judge, I'm taking notes." His voice was a whisper. He was beginning to see, not just the facts, but the invisible scars. Humiliation wasn't just a moment, it was a memory that corroded the soul. The morning dragged on, each minute an eternity of self-flagellation. At noon, the judge indicated he could take a break. "There's a small kitchen in the back, you can get something to eat, and then prepare for your next task." Lunch was a dry sandwich and a glass of water consumed in silence, while Almeida's mind revisited the stories he had just read. He felt a physical discomfort, a nausea that didn't come from the food, but from the bitter bile of guilt. In the afternoon, the judge instructed him to go to the mechanic. "The address is on your phone's GPS, and remember, Sergeant, you are there to help, not to command. Carlos is a hard-working man, and he deserves respect." The journey to Carlos's workshop was an ordeal. Every street, every corner, seemed to lead him deeper into a world he had despised. The workshop was a noisy place, permeated with the smell of oil and grease, a universe of tools and scattered parts. Carlos, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and tired eyes, was bent over an engine, his hand bandaged. "Carlos?" Almeida asked, his voice uncertain. The mechanic raised his head, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Almeida's figure, even without a uniform. There was a mix of surprise and distrust in his gaze. "Yes? Can I help you?" "I'm Almeida," he stammered. "The judge sent me to help with deliveries." Carlos watched him for a long moment, a slow, bitter smile forming on his lips. "Ah, the sergeant. The judge told me about you. Said you have experience with deliveries and with life on the streets." The irony in Carlos's voice was as sharp as the judge's. "Well then, Sergeant, helping is what you're going to do." Carlos pointed to a stack of boxes with motorcycle parts. "I need you to take these parts to Zay's workshop in Villanova, and then stop by Beto's auto-electric shop to pick up some batteries. My hand is bad, and the kid who helps me is sick. You have a driver's license, right?" Almeida nodded, feeling a blush creep up his face. He, the sergeant, the man who gave orders, was now the delivery man. The humiliation was palpable. He picked up the boxes, their weight in his arms, a physical burden that added to the weight of his conscience. Carlos, noticing Almeida's discomfort, continued, his voice softer but still laden with a painful truth. "You know, Sergeant, I used to be a delivery rider. I had my motorcycle, my job, until one day a hasty and arrogant police officer cut me off. I fell, broke my leg, lost my motorcycle, lost my job. No one helped me, no one cared. I had to start over from scratch here at the workshop. It's a hard life, Sergeant, a life you, probably, never imagined existed." Carlos's words were a mirror. Almeida saw himself in that hasty and arrogant police officer. He felt the impact of the story, the pain he had inflicted on others, the pain he was now being forced to feel. He had no way to defend himself, no way to justify himself. With the boxes in his arms, Almeida walked to the workshop van. He, the sergeant, the man of the law, was now the trash delivery man, living the life he had so despised. Every delivery, every curious glance from other workers, every impatient honk in traffic was a constant reminder of his new reality. The re-education had begun, and the ordeal promised to be long and painful. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple, but for Almeida, the day seemed only darker. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple, but for Almeida, the day seemed only darker. The workshop van, noisy and without air conditioning, was an oven on wheels. Every street, every corner seemed to lead him deeper into a world he had despised. The smell of oil and grease, which was once just a distant detail, now permeated his clothes, his skin, his very breath. He felt the weight of the boxes of parts, each one a physical reminder of his new and humiliating reality. The chaotic city traffic, once something he controlled with the siren and the authority of his badge, was now an impersonal enemy. Incessant honks, impatient drivers, the haste he once imposed, he now felt on his skin. He was just one more, a slow vehicle in the city's relentless flow, invisible to most, an annoyance to others. At each stop, at each delivery to Zay's workshop, Beto's auto-electric shop, or small tire repair shops hidden in alleys, he saw the glances, not of respect, but of indifference, of haste, or of a slight distrust that he recognized well, for it was the same he himself used. He felt the weight of the boxes, the back pain that was beginning to manifest, the sweat running down his forehead and back, sticking his shirt to his body. It was physical, exhausting work, very different from the authority he exercised before, sitting in a patrol car or an air-conditioned office. He saw the faces of the other workers, mechanics with calloused hands, hurried counter-clerks, other delivery riders on their motorcycles, all with the same tired look and the same rush in their tasks. He was one of them, and the realization was a punch to the gut. Carlos's story echoed in his mind with every kilometer. The hasty and arrogant police officer who caused the accident, the loss of the motorcycle, the job, the need to start over from scratch. Almeida saw himself in that officer and the pain he had inflicted on others. The pain he was now being forced to feel was almost unbearable. The armor of his authority, which once protected him from any empathy, was now cracked, and the raw reality seeped through the fissures, corroding his pride. When he finally returned to Carlos's workshop, the sun had already set completely, and the fluorescent lights of the shed cast a pale tone on the scene. Almeida unloaded the last parts, his face dirty, his shirt wrinkled and wet with sweat. Carlos watched him for a moment, with a look Almeida couldn't decipher. "So, Sergeant," Carlos asked, his voice without the irony from before, but with a tone of someone who already knew the answer, "what did you think of life on the streets?" Almeida merely shook his head, speechless. The exhaustion was physical and mental, and his throat was dry. Carlos, without saying anything else, grabbed a glass of water and handed it to Almeida. A simple gesture, but one that Almeida felt as a balm, a small, unexpected kindness amidst his humiliation. "There's more tomorrow," Carlos said, as Almeida drank the water eagerly. "The judge wants you to keep helping, and there's a special delivery to make." The drive back to the judge's house was made in silence, Almeida's mind in a whirlwind. The house, once imposing, now seemed like a sanctuary of silence after the chaos and noise of the street. He felt dirty, inadequate, entering that impeccable environment. The judge was waiting for him in the office with the same impeccable posture, the same penetrating gaze. "How was your day, Sergeant?" she asked without preamble, without lifting her eyes from a document she was reading. Almeida tried to organize his thoughts, his sensations. He reported the deliveries, the difficulties of traffic, the physical exhaustion. He mentioned Carlos's story, the painful coincidence that hit him squarely. The judge listened, impassive. She didn't seem surprised nor satisfied, just attentive. "And the emotions, Sergeant? What did you feel being the trash delivery man, being ignored, rushed, feeling the weight of physical labor?" Almeida hesitated. The humiliation, the initial anger, the exhaustion, and the strange, uncomfortable feeling of understanding. I felt the weight, Judge, the weight of the work, of the indifference, and Carlos's story. It made me think. His voice was a whisper, almost inaudible. She nodded slowly, finally raising her eyes to him. "Thinking is a good start, Sergeant. But thinking isn't enough. You need to feel and act." She picked up an envelope from the table and handed it to Almeida. "Tomorrow, Sergeant, you will have a new task. You will accompany a team of app delivery riders during the night. You will see their reality, the risks, the pressures, and you will make some deliveries with them, without a badge, without authority, just as one of them." Almeida felt a chill run down his spine. The night, the dangers, the complete vulnerability. He, a trained police officer, would now be exposed to the same risks that he, in his arrogance, had ignored or even created. "And don't worry about the motorcycle, Sergeant," she added, a slight smile on her lips that didn't reach her eyes, but that chilled Almeida's blood. "Mine is almost ready, but you will have your own to use tomorrow, one that Carlos will provide for you, a delivery motorcycle." The humiliation deepened, becoming almost unbearable. He would no longer be the van driver, a mere helper. He would be one of them on a motorcycle at night, with the wind on his face and danger lurking. "Your report for tomorrow must include the difficulties faced by night delivery riders, working conditions, remuneration, and safety risks, and of course your own impressions. I want you to feel it on your skin, Sergeant, literally." Almeida felt the weight of tomorrow, a darkness that seemed to swallow the little light left in his day. Re-education wasn't just a punishment, it was a forced immersion into a world he had sworn to protect, but which, in truth, he had oppressed. And the ordeal was just beginning. Those last words from the judge, the mention of the motorcycle, the wind on his face and danger lurking, resonated in Almeida's mind like a sentence. The smile that didn't reach her eyes was colder than any look of contempt he had ever received. He, the sergeant, the man of the law, would now be a full-time trash delivery man, and at night, the most dangerous, most invisible shift. The humiliation, already a heavy burden, now deepened, becoming almost unbearable. The walk back to the improvised room in the judge's house was a tunnel of dark thoughts. Each step echoed the loss of his identity, of his authority. He felt like an empty shell, stripped of everything that defined him. The night promised to be an even deeper dive into the abyss he had dug for himself. The next morning, the trip to Carlos's workshop was different. There was no longer the initial surprise or distrust. There was only a bitter resignation in Almeida and a kind of silent expectation in Carlos. The mechanic, his hand still bandaged, pointed to a motorcycle parked in a corner, covered by a dirty cloth. "Your new ride, Sergeant?" Carlos said, pulling off the cloth with an ironic flourish. It was a low-displacement motorcycle, visibly used, with scratches and dents that told stories of many streets and many dangers. The seat was slightly torn, the exhaust pipe seemed to have been patched, but the engine, Almeida noted with a professional eye, seemed well maintained. There was a delivery box on the back, stickered with the faded logo of a generic app. "She's not new, but she's a warrior," Carlos continued, a gleam in his eyes. "She's seen a lot, and she'll see more now with you." He handed Almeida a simple helmet without a visor and a reflective vest. "For your safety. And so they see you, since no one respects you." Almeida felt the weight of the helmet, the roughness of the vest. It was a uniform, yes, but a uniform of invisibility, of vulnerability. He, who once wore a badge and a uniform to command respect, now wore these items to try to protect himself in a world he had helped make dangerous. "The judge said you're going to accompany the app guys tonight," Carlos explained, his voice more serious. "And make your own deliveries. I've already installed the app on your phone, and I've registered you. You'll start receiving calls from 7 tonight. The pay is per delivery, Sergeant. Each ride is a battle, and don't be late. Time is money for these people." Carlos handed him the motorcycle keys, a small, rusty bunch. "Good luck, Sergeant. You'll need it." Almeida mounted the motorcycle, feeling the torn seat beneath him. The machine started with a hesitant but firm rumble. The sensation was strange, raw. Without the protection of a patrol car, without the comfort of air conditioning, just him, the motorcycle, and the city, he felt the wind on his face as he left the workshop, a wind that carried smells of smoke, garbage, and the promise of a long and uncertain night. Back at the judge's house, he prepared for the night shift. He changed his sweaty shirt for a simple t-shirt, jeans, and old sneakers. There was no longer the impeccable uniform, the equipment belt, the weapon. He was just an ordinary man, a delivery rider. The mirror reflected an image he barely recognized, a tired face, eyes that carried the weight of humiliation and a growing apprehension. At 7 o'clock sharp, his cell phone vibrated. The first call, a snack order in a distant neighborhood. He put on his helmet, feeling strangely exposed. The city, under the artificial light of streetlights and signs, took on a new dimension. Shadows were longer, alleys darker, people more rushed, more distrustful. He joined a group of delivery riders in front of a busy diner. They were mostly young, with their colorful vests and delivery boxes. Their faces, marked by haste and fatigue, were a mosaic of the life he was being forced to experience. They looked at him, a new face, perhaps a little older, a little stiffer. No one said anything at first, just quick, evaluative glances. Almeida took his first order, feeling the pressure of time. App navigation was a digital labyrinth, and night traffic, though less intense, was more aggressive. Cars ran red lights. Motorcycles zigzagged dangerously. He, who once reprimanded such conduct, now found himself in the midst of it, trying to survive. With each delivery, he felt the customer's indifference, their haste to grab the order and close the door. Some didn't even look him in the eye. He was an extension of the app, a means to an end. The pay per ride was paltry, and he quickly realized he had to make many deliveries to earn a minimum of dignity. At one of the stops, on a dimly lit street, he saw two young men on another motorcycle approach a delivery rider who had just dismounted. Almeida's police instinct screamed. He hesitated for a second, his hand empty where his weapon would have been. The delivery rider, a thin young man, handed over his cell phone without resistance. The assailants vanished into the darkness as quickly as they appeared. Almeida felt a chill, a mix of anger and helplessness. He had witnessed a robbery, and he could do nothing. He was one of them now, a potential victim. Later, during a brief rest, he overheard the conversations of the other delivery riders, complaints about low pay, the risks, accidents, lack of safety. They shared stories of robberies, of customers who didn't pay, of cars cutting them off. There was a silent solidarity among them, a mutual understanding of the harshness of that life. "It's tough, man," a young man named Lucas said to him, noticing Almeida's thoughtful gaze. "We work our butts off day and night, risk our lives, and at the end of the month, we can barely pay the bills. But it's what we've got, right? Better than nothing." Almeida merely nodded, Lucas's words echoing Carlos's story. The armor of his authority had not just cracked, it had completely disintegrated. He was no longer the sergeant who judged, but the delivery rider who felt injustice and vulnerability on his skin. The night advanced, and physical fatigue mingled with mental exhaustion. Every turn, Every traffic light, every delivery, was a constant reminder of his new reality. The wind on his face, which was once a threat, was now a constant, a silent companion on his re-education journey. He felt the weight of the delivery box, the smell of food that permeated his clothes, the pain in his back and arms. When he finally returned to the judge's house, the sky was already beginning to lighten, tinged with a pale grey. The motorcycle, dirty with dust and soot, seemed a reflection of his own state. He dismounted, his legs wobbly, his body aching. The house, once a sanctuary of silence, now seemed a refuge, a safe haven after the night's storm. The judge wasn't waiting for him in the office, but Almeida knew she was there, somewhere, and that her penetrating eyes had already assessed every detail of his experience. The ordeal was far from over, and for the first time, Almeida felt that perhaps, just perhaps, he was beginning to understand. The motorcycle's roar silenced in the early morning, but the city's noise still echoed in Almeida's mind. His wobbly legs barely supported him as he dismounted the dirty machine, his aching body protesting with every movement. The smell of fried food and exhaust fumes permeated his clothes, a pungent reminder of the night he had just lived. The judge's house, once a symbol of his imprisonment and humiliation, now seemed a refuge, a safe haven after the storm of dangers and indifference he had faced. He walked towards the door, each step a battle against fatigue. The helmet, once a protective item, now seemed a heavy burden, a helmet of invisibility. Upon entering, the silence of the house was almost deafening, a brutal contrast to the chaos of the streets. He didn't see the judge, but he felt her presence, an observing shadow that seemed to permeate every corner of that place. She didn't need to be there for him to know he was being evaluated. In the improvised room, Almeida threw the helmet and vest onto the chair, his t-shirt clinging to his body with sweat and soot. The image in the mirror was of an exhausted man, his eyes red and sunken, his face marked by tension. He barely recognized himself. The imposing sergeant, the man of the law who had kicked a motorcycle and assaulted a woman, had disintegrated, giving way to a specter of himself, an anonymous and vulnerable delivery rider. The shower was a temporary relief, the hot water trying to wash away not only the physical dirt, but also the mental exhaustion and the weight of humiliation. But the images of the night persisted, the empty gaze of the robbed young man, the indifferent haste of the customers, the tired faces of the other delivery riders, the paltry pay that barely covered fuel. The armor of his authority had not just cracked, it had completely disintegrated. He was no longer the sergeant who judged, but the delivery rider who felt injustice and vulnerability on his skin. The next morning, Almeida's body screamed in protest. Every muscle seemed to have been subjected to a torture session. The pain in his back, his arms, his legs. He dragged himself to the small table where a notebook and a pen awaited him. The report, the task the judge had imposed. He needed to transform the raw experience of the night into words, into a formal analysis. The pen hovered over the blank paper. How to begin? How to describe the feeling of being invisible, of being a mere link in a consumption chain, faceless, voiceless. He took a deep breath, the memories of the night crowding his mind. The difficulties faced by night delivery riders are multifaceted and severe, he began to write, his handwriting a little shaky. The pay per delivery is paltry, forcing them into exhaustive shifts to achieve a minimum income. This exposes them to a high risk of accidents due to fatigue and time pressure. He continued, detailing the precarious working conditions, the lack of support from the apps, the indifference of customers, the constant exposure to the dangers of traffic and crime. He described the robbery he witnessed, the helplessness he felt, seeing the young delivery rider lose his only means of work. He wrote about the silent solidarity among the delivery riders, the only support network that seemed to exist in that underworld. My own impressions, he wrote, hesitating for a moment. It was the hardest part. How to admit to himself and to her how wrong he had been. The experience was revealing. I, who once saw these workers as mere executors of a service, now understand the depth of their struggles. The arrogance with which I treated them, the way I dehumanized them, is something that now deeply shames me. He didn't try to sugarcoat the truth. The physical pain was real, the mental exhaustion palpable, and the shame a heavy burden. He described the fear, the vulnerability, the feeling of being an easy target in the darkness of the night. He felt that, for the first time in a long time, he was being honest, not just with the judge, but with himself. When he finished, the sun was already high, and the house was in an almost oppressive silence. He took the report to the judge's office, where the door was ajar. She was sitting at her desk, imposing as ever, her eyes fixed on a monitor. She didn't lift her head when he entered. "Sergeant Almeida," she said, her voice cold and emotionless, without taking her eyes off the screen. "Your report." He placed the paper on the desk, feeling the weight of the silence. She finally looked at him, her penetrating eyes sweeping him up and down, as if trying to read his soul. There was a slight tilt of her head, almost imperceptible. She picked up the report, her long, slender fingers turning the pages. Almeida watched her face, trying to decipher any emotion, but she was a sphinx. Each line was read with intense concentration, and the silence in the room stretched, becoming almost unbearable. When she finished, she placed the report on the desk without a word. Her gaze returned to Almeida, more intense than ever. "Your words are adequate, Sergeant," she finally said, her voice still emotionless. "But words are just words. True understanding manifests in actions." Almeida felt a chill. He knew the ordeal was far from over. "You felt it on your skin, Sergeant. But you haven't felt enough yet," she continued, a slight smile appearing on her lips, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your next task will be more immersive. You will spend the entire next week as a delivery rider, day and night, without breaks, except to sleep and eat. And not in my house. You will live as they live. You will find a place to sleep. You will manage your own resources. You will truly feel the financial pressure." Almeida's heart froze. A whole week. Living on the streets or in some precarious place, managing every penny, the vulnerability would be total. "And to ensure you don't forget who you are," she added, her eyes fixed on his, "you will wear this vest." She took a reflective vest from a drawer. It wasn't an ordinary vest. On the back, in block letters, it read, "Sergeant Almeida, Delivery Rider in Re-Education." The humiliation reached a new level, a direct blow to his already fragile dignity. He would be a spectacle, a walking reminder of his downfall. "You will report your expenses, your earnings, your difficulties in finding a safe place to sleep, people's perception of you in this vest," she instructed, "and of course the safety risks you will face. I want you to feel the weight of marginalized existence, Sergeant, literally." Almeida took the vest, the rough fabric in his hands. The words on his back seemed to burn. He was now a walking billboard of his own shame. The judge, with her calculated cruelty, had found a new way to deepen his lesson. The wind on his face, which was once a threat, would now be a constant reminder of his new and painful reality. And the ordeal, he realized, was just beginning to show its true face. The vest, with its blaring letters, was a punch to Almeida's stomach. It wasn't just fabric, it was a public testament to his downfall, a silent scream of humiliation that would echo down every street, every corner, every delivery. The words, "Sergeant Almeida, Delivery Rider in Re-Education," seemed to burn his skin, a stigma visible to the entire world. The judge, with her calculated cruelty, had found the most effective way to strip him of any last shred of dignity. He wouldn't just be a delivery rider, he would be a spectacle, a walking reminder of his own shame. He held the vest, the rough fabric in his hands, and felt the weight of that sentence, a whole week, day and night, without the comfort of her house, without the security of a guaranteed roof. He would have to live like them, the invisible, the marginalized, find a place to sleep, manage every penny, feel hunger, cold fear. The vulnerability would be total, absolute. "You may go now, Sergeant." The judge's voice broke the silence, cold and distant as ever. "Your shift officially begins at noon. Don't be late. And remember, every detail matters. Every penny, every interaction, every risk. I want a meticulous report of your marginalized existence." Almeida nodded, his throat dry. There was no room for argument, for pleas. He was a prisoner, and she, his tormentor. He turned, the vest still in his hands, and walked out of the office, feeling her gaze on his back, piercing him like needles. As he exited the judge's house gate, the sun was already high, and the city buzzed with its morning routine. Cars honked, hurried people walked on the sidewalks. The smell of coffee and fresh bread hung in the air. But for Almeida, the world seemed different. Every gaze that met his was a judgment. Every distant laugh, a sneer. He felt shame burn on his face, but there was no escaping it. He was Sergeant Almeida, the delivery rider in re-education. His first task wasn't a delivery, but the search for a place to exist. Where does a homeless delivery rider sleep? Where does he keep his few belongings? The raw, stark reality of life on the streets hit him hard. He had no money for a hotel, not even for a shelter. His pockets were empty, his bank account frozen. He needed to work, and fast. He turned on the app, the familiar roar of the motorcycle sounding like a lament. The first call came quickly, a lunch delivery to a distant neighborhood. He accepted, feeling the urgency of every kilometer, every delivery. Money, once an abstraction, was now a vital necessity, the thin line between survival and destitution. As he rode through the city, people's stares were inevitable. Some were curious, others pitying, but most were indifferent. He was just another delivery rider, but with a peculiarity that made him an easy target for whispers and furtive glances. At a traffic light, a group of young people pointed to his back and laughed. Almeida felt his blood boil, the old sergeant wanting to react, to impose his authority. But he was just a delivery rider, and his authority had been stripped away. He simply lowered his head, swallowing the humiliation. The afternoon dragged on, a succession of deliveries, busy streets, hurried customers who barely looked him in the eye. The physical fatigue from the previous night was still present, and mental tension added to it. He felt pain in his back, arms and legs. His stomach rumbled, but he needed to save every penny. A bottle of water, a dry bread bought at a cheap bakery. That was his meal. As night fell, the city transformed. Lights came on, shadows lengthened, and dangers multiplied. Almeida began to feel the weight of insecurity. Where would he spend the night? A park bench, an overpass. The idea of sleeping outdoors, exposed to the elements and crime, was terrifying. He, the sergeant who swore to protect citizens, was now one of them, an easy target, a vulnerable one. He stopped his motorcycle on a busy street, observing the other delivery riders who gathered at strategic points. They seemed to have a routine, a tacit knowledge of the best places to rest, to eat, to protect themselves. He was a stranger in a world he once despised, and now he desperately needed to understand. "Hey, Sergeant!" a voice called him. It was Lucas, the young delivery rider from the previous night. He approached, a smile on his face. "What's that thing on your back, man? Delivery rider in re-education. Is it some kind of prank?" Almeida felt a mix of shame and relief. Lucas wasn't mocking. There was genuine curiosity in his voice. It's a long story, Lucas," he replied, his voice hoarse. I'm learning. Lucas shook his head, a look of understanding appearing in his eyes. Life as a delivery rider teaches you a lot, Sergeant, especially how to get by. You'll see. He pointed to a dark alley. There are some guys who sleep there, near the market. It's not ideal, but it's safer than the open street, and we always help each other, you know? If you need anything, just call. Those words, "we always help each other," echoed in Almeida's mind. The solidarity he had witnessed the previous night was not an exception, but the rule. In that underworld of invisibles, the only safety net was the unity among them. He was now part of this forced brotherhood, a member of a group he had dehumanized. The night advanced, and physical and mental exhaustion became unbearable. Almeida made a few more deliveries, each one a Herculean effort. He felt the cold of the early morning beginning to bite, and the prospect of sleeping in an alley with the smell of garbage and the constant threat was desolate. He had no home, no refuge. He was, for the first time in his life, truly helpless. He headed to the alley Lucas had indicated, his heart pounding in his chest. The darkness was almost total, and the shadows seemed to hide invisible dangers. He saw some figures wrapped in blankets, trying to find some comfort on the cold ground. That would be his home for a week. The humiliation was deep, but the lesson, he realized, was just beginning to manifest in its most brutal form. The sergeant had fallen, and the fall was longer and more painful than he could ever have imagined. The alley was a pit of darkness and odors, accumulated trash, old urine, the metallic scent of something indefinable that hung in the air. Almeida huddled against the cold wall, the blaring vest on his back. Now, an even easier target in the gloom. The figures wrapped in blankets looked like ghosts, just silhouettes breathing heavily, some coughing. He tried to find a minimally comfortable position, but the concrete floor was relentless, and every protrusion seemed to dig into his ribs. The roar of the motorcycle, once a familiar sound of freedom, now seemed a distant lament, an echo of the life he had lost. The cold of the early morning began to bite, penetrating his thin clothes. He pulled his jacket closer, a futile gesture against the dampness that seeped into his bones. His eyes swept the darkness, searching for invisible threats. Every shadow seemed to move, every distant sound a harbinger of danger. He, the sergeant who patrolled the streets, was now the prey, the vulnerable one. The irony was a slow poison, corroding his soul. Where was the safety he swore to protect? Where was the authority he so cherished? Vanished like smoke in the wind. The sky began to lighten, a pale grey announcing a new day of torment. Almeida got up, his body stiff and aching. Every muscle protested, every joint cracked. He felt the weight of the sleepless night, the physical and mental exhaustion that would accompany him throughout the day. The other delivery riders began to stir, some already starting their motorcycles, others looking for cheap coffee. There was no time for luxuries, for lamentations. The struggle for survival began anew with each dawn. He turned on the app, his stomach rumbling in protest. The first call came quickly. Breakfast for an office downtown. He accepted, feeling the urgency of every kilometer, every delivery. Money, once an abstraction, was now the thin line between hunger and a dry piece of bread. As he rode, the vest seemed to attract even more stares in the daylight. At a traffic light, a driver in a luxury car pointed to his back and laughed, commenting something to the passenger. Almeida felt his blood boil, but swallowed his anger. He was Sergeant Almeida, the delivery rider in re-education. He was a spectacle. The morning dragged on in a series of deliveries, each one a test of his patience and physical endurance. He climbed stairs in buildings without elevators, waited in endless lines, dealt with impatient customers. Each interaction was a micro-universe of dehumanization, where he was merely a tool, a means to an end. In the middle of the afternoon, while waiting for an order at a crowded restaurant, his phone vibrated. A message from the judge. "Sergeant, the report must be submitted tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp. Don't forget to include your reflections on the public perception of your vest and how it affects your dignity. And please, be honest. I'm eager to see if the lesson is being learned." Almeida's heart froze. Tomorrow. Time had flown, and the week of his ordeal was coming to an end. The pressure was immense. He not only needed to survive, but also to articulate his experience in a way that would satisfy the judge. He picked up the notebook, his hands slightly trembling. Public perception of the vest, scorn, laughter, dehumanization, affects dignity deeply, feeling like an object of ridicule. Reflection, the invisibility of delivery riders, is a form of protection against judgment. But the vest makes me visible in a humiliating way. He felt a knot in his throat. Those words, written by his own hand, were a confession of his vulnerability, of his pain. He, the man who had always prided himself on his strength and control, was now recording his own disintegration. Later, while making a delivery in an upscale neighborhood, he saw a police car parked. For an instant, his heart pounded. His old life, his former identity beckoned to him. He thought of approaching, of asking for help, of begging for an end to that torture. But then he saw the reflection of his vest in a shop window. Delivery rider in re-education. He was an outcast, an exile. No one there would recognize him, or if they did, it would be with disdain. He rode on, his head bowed, the weight of the vest heavier than ever. The loneliness was overwhelming, but the lesson, he realized, was deepening. It wasn't just about humiliation, but about the loss of identity, the deconstruction of everything he believed himself to be. The judge didn't just want to punish him, she wanted to transform him, and the process, he knew, was far from over. Night approached, and with it, the need to find a place to rest. The gas station was a temporary refuge, but the uncertainty of the future, the imminence of the report, and the judge's final judgment hung over him like a sentence. The night at the gas station didn't bring the rest Almeida so craved. The smell of diesel and stale coffee permeated the air, and the sporadic sounds of cars passing on the highway were a constant reminder of a world he now saw from a completely different perspective. He was sitting on the wooden bench, the notebook open on his lap, the pen in his hand, but the words seemed to flee. The judge's deadline hung over him like a guillotine. Tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp. With each beat of his exhausted heart, he felt time slipping away. He tried to organize the notes scribbled throughout the week, expenses, earnings, difficulties, interactions. But the hardest part, the most crucial, was what the judge had explicitly asked for. Your reflections on the public perception of your vest and how it affects your dignity. Dignity, the word echoed in his mind, bitter and ironic. He, Sergeant Almeida, who had always prided himself on his demeanor, on his authority, was now an object of scorn, a delivery rider in re-education. He began to write, his handwriting trembling under the faint light of a distant streetlight. The public perception of the vest is, invariably, one of mockery and disdain. People laugh, point, make derogatory comments. Look at the delivery rider in re-education. The phrase became a mantra of humiliation. He paused, his pen suspended. The truth was deeper, more painful. It wasn't just the mockery, it was the invisibility that transformed into forced visibility. Before, delivery riders were part of the landscape, almost ignored. Now, with that blaring vest, he was a spectacle, a living reminder of a failure, of a punishment. This affects my dignity in a profound and corrosive way, he continued, feeling a knot in his throat. The feeling is one of being stripped of all respect, of being reduced to an object of ridicule. My identity, once linked to authority and service, has been replaced by a mark of shame. With each glance, each laugh, I feel diminished, dehumanized. The uniform, which once conferred power upon me, is now the vest that exposes me to vulnerability and contempt. The words flowed, laden with a brutal honesty he never imagined being capable of expressing. He was writing to the woman who had broken him, and in some way this confession was part of the reconstruction process. He remembered that group of young people at the traffic light, their laughter echoing. The anger, the old anger, was still there, but now it came with a pang of shame. He had been like them, in his own way, mocking and despising those he considered inferior. He thought of Lucas, the young delivery rider, who extended a hand without asking for anything in return. The solidarity of that silent brotherhood at the gas station was a stark contrast to the judge's calculated cruelty and the indifference of the world outside. The help of other delivery riders like Lucas has been an unexpected counterpoint. Amidst public humiliation, I found a form of camaraderie and mutual support that I, in my previous life, would never have valued. They saw me not as a delivery rider in re-education, but as a colleague, an equal. The pen scratched the paper, each word a small victory against wounded pride. The lesson, he realized, wasn't just about feeling the weight of marginalized existence, but about recognizing the humanity in those he had despised. It was about losing his own identity to find a new one, more humble, more empathetic. The judge didn't just want to punish him. She wanted him to see the world through the eyes of those he had oppressed. And he was seeing it. He finished the report, his body aching, his mind exhausted, but with a strange clarity. The last lines were the hardest. My final reflection is that the invisibility of delivery riders is, paradoxically, a form of protection against judgment and scorn. The vest made me visible in a humiliating way, forcing me to confront my own arrogance and the dehumanization that I, in my previous role, often perpetrated. The lesson is being learned, Judge. The weight of marginalized existence is real, and dignity, a privilege I never knew I possessed until I lost it. He closed the notebook, the weight of the newly written words seeming heavier than the vest itself. Dawn began to tinge the sky with a pale gray, announcing the day of his sentence. He didn't know what the judge would do with those words, with that confession, whether she would believe in his transformation or if she would see only another attempt at manipulation. The fear was palpable, but for the first time in a long time, there was also a strange sense of peace. He had exposed himself, laid himself bare. The final judgment was near, and he was ready to face it, not as Sergeant Almeida, but as a man who had, by force, begun to see. Dawn tinged the sky with a pale gray, and with it, the urgency of an imminent deadline. Sergeant Almeida, or rather, just Almeida, felt the weight of the notebook in his hands, heavier than the very vest that marked him. The gas station, his temporary refuge, now seemed like a starting point for the unknown. The motorcycle, his faithful companion in his ordeal, roared to life on the first try, a familiar sound that for a brief instant brought him back to reality. The path to the courthouse was a journey of contrasts. Every street, every corner was a vivid reminder of his old life. He passed patrol cars, uniformed colleagues who, if they recognized him under the blaring vest, would certainly do so with a mix of pity and scorn. But he didn't see them. His eyes, once fixed on hierarchy and power, now noticed the cracks in the asphalt, the graffiti on the walls, the tired faces of workers waiting for the bus. He saw the world from the bottom up, and the perspective was brutally different. The vest, once a burden of humiliation, was now almost a second skin. The stares, the laughs, the jokes, he had developed a shell, not of indifference, but of resignation. Anger still simmered, but it was a contained anger, tempered by shame and forced understanding. He was no longer Sergeant Almeida, the man who commanded respect with a look. He was the delivery rider in re-education, a walking spectacle, and the lesson, he knew, was far from over. Upon arriving at the imposing courthouse building, the sense of displacement was overwhelming. That was his territory, or at least it had been. He had entered there countless times, head held high, with the authority of his uniform. Now, he was just another in the crowd, a delivery rider with a package, the package of his own soul. Security, once a mere nod, was now a detailed scrutiny. The vest attracted curious glances, some amused, others disdainful. He presented his identification, the name he had tried to forget for a week, and was directed to the judge's floor. The corridor leading to Judge Silva's chambers was long and silent, each step echoing the anxious beat of his heart. The dark wooden door seemed a portal to a final judgment. He knocked, his hand slightly trembling, and heard the cold, clear voice that had condemned him to that week of purgatory. "Enter Sergeant Almeida." He opened the door and entered. The office was austere but elegant, with shelves full of law books and a large window overlooking the city. Judge Silva was sitting at her desk, her posture impeccable, her eyes fixed on him. There wasn't a hint of emotion on her face, just a keen intelligence that seemed to see through his soul. She wasn't wearing the golden badge he had seen at that roadblock, but her authority was palpable, emanating from every fiber of her being. "Good morning, Judge," he said, his voice hoarser than he expected. "Good morning, Sergeant. The report?" She extended her hand, and Almeida handed over the notebook, feeling cold sweat trickle down his back. It was like handing over a confession, a part of himself, to be dissected and judged. The judge took the notebook and began to read. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of pages. Almeida observed her every movement, every micro-expression, trying to decipher what she was thinking. Her eyes scanned the lines he had written with such pain and honesty. He remembered the words. "The public perception of the vest is, invariably, one of mockery and disdain. This affects my dignity in a profound and corrosive way. My identity, once linked to authority and service, has been replaced by a mark of shame." He saw a slight frown when she read about the invisibility that transformed into forced visibility, and an almost imperceptible nod when she reached the part about the camaraderie and mutual support he had found among the other delivery riders. The part about losing his own identity to find a new one, more humble, more empathetic, seemed to hold her attention for a longer moment. She closed the notebook, the dry sound echoing in the room. She looked at him, and Almeida felt a chill. "Sergeant Almeida," she began, her voice calm but laden with weight, "your report is honest, brutally honest, I would say. The words you wrote, the confession of your vulnerability, of your pain, are a good start." Almeida felt a pale ray of hope. A good start. That meant not all was lost. "But," she continued, and the word hung in the air like a sentence, "true transformation is not measured only in words written under duress. The true lesson, Sergeant, is lived. It is internalized. It is demonstrated." He swallowed hard. Hope dissolved. "You wrote about the loss of dignity, about dehumanization. You felt on your skin what it's like to be an object of scorn, to be invisible when it's inconvenient, and humiliatingly visible when it suits others. This is progress, great progress for the man who kicked a citizen's motorcycle and called her a trash delivery woman." The mention of the incident chilled Almeida's blood. The memory of that day, of that slap on the helmet, of that golden badge, still haunted him. "Your period of re-education as a delivery rider," the judge continued, "is formally concluded. The vest may be removed." A sigh of relief escaped Almeida's lips. The vest, that symbol of his downfall, he could take it off. However, the judge added, and Almeida's heart sank again, the lesson doesn't end here. I believe you've begun to see, but that vision needs to be deepened. The empathy you've started to develop needs to be tested, and not just in an environment where you are the victim. She leaned slightly forward, her eyes fixed on his. Your next phase of re-education, Sergeant Almeida, will be in a community policing unit in one of the city's most underprivileged areas. Without your sergeant's uniform, you will be a basic officer, working directly with the population, without the shield of your old authority, without the power to impose, only the power to serve. And you will continue to report to me weekly, not about your reflections, but about your actions, about how you are applying what you've learned, about how you are rebuilding the trust you broke. The shock hit him like a lightning bolt. Community policing, without a sergeant's uniform. He, a decorated sergeant, reduced to a basic officer in an underprivileged community. It was a more subtle, more insidious punishment, but perhaps even deeper than the week as a delivery rider. The judge didn't just want to humiliate him, she wanted to deconstruct him and rebuild him from scratch. Understood, Sergeant? Her voice was a steel thread. Almeida, still processing the new sentence, could only stammer, "Yes, Judge." "Excellent. Your new post begins next Monday. And remember, Sergeant, the lesson is being learned, but the journey to true dignity and to the respect you so cherished and which you now need to regain is just beginning." She made a gesture with her hand, indicating that the audience was over. Almeida stood up, his body still stiff, but his mind in a whirlwind. He had gotten rid of the vest, but a new and more complex form of re-education awaited him. The judge had not freed him. She had merely changed the chains, making them invisible, but no less heavy. The final judgment was yet to come, and he knew that the battle to become a different man was just beginning. He left the office, the silence of the corridor now seeming an echo of his own uncertainty. The silence of the courthouse corridor, once an echo of uncertainty, now seemed to amplify the whirlwind in Almeida's mind. He had gotten rid of the vest, yes, but Judge Silva had not freed him. She had merely changed the chains, making them invisible, but no less heavy. The sense of relief from removing the vest was quickly replaced by an even greater weight, that of his own stripped identity. Sergeant Almeida, decorated, respected, feared, would now be a basic officer out of uniform in an underprivileged community. The humiliation hadn't ended, it had merely become more sophisticated, deeper. He walked through the corridors, his head bowed, avoiding the glances that, he knew, would judge him even without the blaring vest. News of his re-education must have already spread like wildfire through the force. Each step was a reminder of the precipice he had dug for himself. As he left the courthouse, the midday sun seemed blinding, and the street air, once a breath of freedom, now carried the weight of a new sentence. The first thing he did upon arriving home was take off the vest, not with anger, but with a strange reverence. He folded it carefully like an artifact from a past life and put it away in the back of a closet. That piece of orange and green fabric, once a symbol of shame, was now a visible scar of his downfall and a constant reminder of the lesson Judge Silva had forced him to learn. The motorcycle, his faithful companion in his ordeal, seemed to watch him in silence, as if it knew the journey was not yet over. The weekend was a purgatory of reflection. Almeida tried to prepare for what was to come, but how does one prepare for the unknown? He, who had always controlled every aspect of his professional life, now found himself at the mercy of a greater force, of a judge who seemed to see through his soul. He read and reread the report he had written, the words he thought would be his redemption, and realized they were merely the preface. The true story, the true transformation would begin now, on the streets of a community where he would be just one among many, without the shield of his old authority. On Monday, Almeida put on simple civilian clothes, jeans, a neutral t-shirt. There was no uniform, no visible badge, just the invisible badge of his new mission. The address was for a community policing unit in one of the city's most complex areas, a labyrinth of alleys and cramped houses, where the law of the street often prevailed over the law of the state. Upon arrival, the difference was stark. There was none of the formalism of the precincts, nor the rigid hierarchy he knew. The unit was a small building, almost camouflaged among the houses, with a constant flow of residents coming and going, seeking help, filing complaints, or simply talking to the few officers present. He was greeted by an older sergeant, with a tired but genuine smile. "Almeida, right?" Judge Silva informed us. "Welcome to reality," the sergeant said, extending his hand. "Here, we don't use force first. We use conversation, listening. We are part of the community, not an invader." Almeida felt a knot in his throat. He, the man who kicked motorcycles and slapped helmets, would now have to learn to talk, to listen. The first week was a shock. He, accustomed to commanding, now received orders from younger officers who knew the community like the back of their hands. He saw the distrust in the residents' eyes, the fear, the contained anger. He saw children playing in dirty alleys, mothers struggling to feed their children, young people without prospects. He found himself in situations he never imagined, mediating neighbor disputes, helping to find a lost dog, advising on how to get documents. There were no major operations, high-speed chases, or the adrenaline of roadblocks. There was just everyday life, the routine of a community that needed help, not imposition. And gradually, the shell of cynicism he had built over the years began to crack. He remembered the other delivery riders, the camaraderie he had found among them. That same solidarity, that same resilience, he now saw in the faces of the residents of the underprivileged community. He remembered the invisibility, the dehumanization, and he realized that in a way, he was once again on the side of the invisible, but this time with the mission of making them visible, of giving voice to those who had none. The nights were filled with silent reflections. He no longer wrote in a notebook, but the words echoed in his mind. "About your actions," the judge had said. He needed to show, not just tell. He needed to rebuild trust, not just his own, but the trust between the police and the community. It was arduous, slow, often thankless work, but for the first time in a long time, Almeida felt a purpose that went beyond his own advancement. Judge Silva had not freed him. She had thrown him into a new kind of prison, a prison of conscience, where the only key was empathy and service. And as he walked through the alleys, without a uniform, without a badge, just a man trying to make a difference, he began to understand. True dignity was not something imposed, but something earned, one brick at a time, in the heart of every person he managed to touch. The journey was just beginning, and Almeida, the former sergeant, the former delivery rider, was finally ready to walk it.